The summer of 1912 should have been an ordinary one for Villisca, a quiet town in Iowa surrounded by cornfields that stretched endlessly under the sun. Families knew one another by name, doors were left unlocked, and neighbors gathered at church picnics and local socials. It was the kind of place where time felt slow, where daily life unfolded in a rhythm of farm work, school lessons, and Sunday hymns. Yet in June of that year, Villisca would become synonymous with something else entirely, something unspeakable, something that would mark the town forever. For it was here that an entire family and two young guests who had simply stayed the night were discovered slaughtered in their beds, their lives extinguished with the swing of an axe. The case has no single face to embody it. Unlike many crimes that leave behind a clear suspect or a confession, the Villisca axe murders remain a mystery suspended in time. But at the heart of the story was the Moore family, Josiah and Sarah Moore, respected members of the community, and their four children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul. On the evening of June 9th, they attended a church program, cheerful and unsuspecting, returning home with two neighborhood girls, Ina and Lena Stillinger, who would spend the night. It should have been one of countless ordinary evenings in the little white house on the corner. Instead, it became the stage for a nightmare that would shock the nation. The hook of this story lies not in gore, but in silence. Imagine the moment after midnight, when the town was still, the crickets loud in the fields, and the only light came from a pale moon hanging over the prairie. Inside the Moore house, the family slept. Upstairs, Sarah lay beside her husband, while the children curled in their small rooms, safe in the innocence of dreams. In another room, Ina and Lena settled in borrowed beds. The axe, a simple tool of rural life, rested somewhere within reach, its wooden handle familiar to any household of the time. And then sometime between the quiet hours of darkness and the fragile light of dawn, someone lifted that axe, and Villisca was changed forever. When neighbors discovered the scene the next morning, the sight was so horrifying that words seemed insufficient. Curtains had been drawn over the windows, mirrors draped in cloth, as though someone had deliberately tried to cover the gaze of both the living and the dead. Every member of the Moore family, along with the Stillinger girls, had been struck with such brutal force that the weapon itself was said to have left deep impressions in the walls and ceilings. The killer, whoever they were, had moved with chilling deliberation, extinguishing life after life in the darkness, leaving behind only a silence that the sun could not erase. But the mystery that draws us closer is not only the violence, it is the absence of answers. How could such an atrocity occur in a town where everyone was known? How could someone move through the small wooden house swinging a heavy axe without waking the neighbors, without raising alarm? Who had the strength, the cold resolve to carry out such a crime and then vanish without a trace? These are questions that linger more than a century later, unanswered, gnawing at the edge of our understanding. The Moore house itself became more than a crime scene. It became a symbol, a place where innocence and brutality collided. Those who entered spoke of the air being different, heavy, as though the walls themselves remembered. Reporters traveled from across the nation to capture the story. Lawmen, both local and state, descended on Villisca, convinced they could unravel the mystery. Yet with each passing day, the trail grew colder and suspicion turned inward. Neighbors began to look at one another differently. Doors that had once stood unlocked were bolted shut at night. The harmony of small-town life fractured under the weight of fear. In the years that followed, suspects would come and go, local figures, traveling strangers, even preachers. Some confessions would surface, but none could withstand scrutiny. The case became a labyrinth of dead ends, a puzzle that resisted solution. And perhaps that is what makes the Villisca axe murders so enduring. It was not just the brutality of the crime, but the fact that it was never resolved, leaving an open wound in the historical record. The identity of the killer and the reason for the crime remain shadows on the page, forcing us to stare not only into the mystery of the past, but into the unsettling silence of human capacity for violence. To begin this story is to step into a world that feels both distant and familiar. Villisca in 1912 was not unlike many towns of its time. Close-knit, hard-working, bound by faith and community. Yet even in such a place, terror found a way in. As we move deeper into the events of that June night, we must carry with us the image of the little house, quiet under the moon, where laughter had filled the rooms only hours before. It is a reminder that history is not only made by wars and politics, but by the hidden tragedies that slip into the lives of ordinary people and leave behind questions that echo across generations. To understand the weight of the Villisca axe murders, we must step back into the world of 1912 America. Villisca, Iowa, was not a place one expected to be etched into the pages of infamy. It was a town of fewer than 3,000 people, nestled within rolling fields of corn and quiet roads that stretched to the horizon. The Midwest at this time was built upon routines that were both simple and demanding. The rhythm of life was dictated by the land, the seasons, and the church bell that called families together on Sundays. In such towns, people measured success not in wealth or luxury, but in the steadiness of family life and the trust of neighbors. Against this backdrop of normalcy, the murders would come to feel even more grotesque, like a rupture in the very fabric of rural American identity. The early 20th century was a time of great transition. The nation was on the cusp of modernity. Electricity was beginning to spread, automobiles were slowly replacing horse-drawn buggies, and newspapers carried news from across the country with increasing speed. Yet places like Villisca still clung to an older way of life. The railroad connected them to the wider world, but most families rarely ventured beyond the county line. Children grew up working the farms, attending one-room schoolhouses, and participating in local socials that often doubled as courtship rituals. Villisca itself had a small commercial district with general stores, blacksmiths, and a few churches that served as the pillars of the community. Religion played a central role in shaping life here. The Moore family, like many others, was deeply involved in their local Presbyterian church. Church socials, Bible studies, and summer programs were not merely religious gatherings. They were the lifeblood of social interaction in a town where entertainment was scarce. Faith was a source of comfort against the harsh realities of farm life, where illness, accidents, and unpredictable weather could change a family's fortunes overnight. It was also a binding agent, creating trust among families who often relied on one another in times of hardship. In this context, the idea that violence could penetrate such a sacred space felt unthinkable. Yet beneath this surface of stability lay tensions that were not unique to Villisca. Across rural America, the early 1900s brought waves of change that unsettled communities. Immigration had brought new faces and traditions to the Midwest, sometimes welcomed, sometimes met with suspicion. Labor disputes were growing in cities, with whispers of strikes and unrest making their way even to small towns. And the nation itself was becoming more connected, with newspapers carrying tales of crime, corruption, and scandal from faraway places. Against this backdrop, the safety of Villisca seemed fragile, its boundaries porous. The town may have appeared isolated, but it was never truly sealed off from the wider world. One cannot ignore the role of technology in shaping how the Villisca case would be perceived. By 1912, photography had become accessible enough that images of crime scenes could be circulated, freezing horror into permanence. The press had developed a taste for sensationalism, often embellishing details to capture readers' attention. The Midwest, once seen as the heartland of wholesome American values, was increasingly depicted as a place where shocking crimes could erupt without warning. The murders in Villisca would become part of this trend, a story that newspapers seized upon not just for its brutality, but because it seemed to defy the very image of small-town innocence. But what was life like inside the Moore household before that fateful night? Josiah Moore was a successful businessman, owning a farm implement store that brought him recognition in town. He was known as hardworking and respectable, though his professional life occasionally stirred small rivalries with others in the community. Sarah Moore, his wife, was described as devoted, both to her children and to her church. Their home, painted white and modest in design, was not unlike countless others across Iowa, a symbol of stability and prosperity achieved through diligence and faith. Their children, ranging from 5 to 11 years old, represented the promise of the next generation. To know that such a household could be destroyed so suddenly was to realize that no one, no matter how secure or well-regarded, was immune from the possibility of catastrophe. Community identity was central to the people of Villisca. In towns like this, the concept of privacy was minimal. Neighbors knew one another's business, and reputations carried weight. A good name was as valuable as land or livestock, and families worked tirelessly to uphold it. This intimacy also meant that when the murders occurred, suspicion naturally turned inward. Who could have done such a thing? Surely not a stranger. No one could believe that an outsider had simply wandered into town, committed such a horrific act, and vanished. Instead, people began to look at familiar faces with new doubt. Long friendships cracked under the strain of fear, and the web of trust that held Villisca together began to unravel thread by thread. It is also important to understand the cultural fascination with crime in early 20th century America. Though radio was not yet widespread, newspapers filled the role of mass media, and editors knew that nothing sold papers faster than stories of scandal and bloodshed. The Villisca murders arrived at a time when public appetite for true crime was growing, and journalists flocked to the town, eager to paint lurid pictures of the crime scene. For residents, this intrusion was both a curse and a burden. Their grief was turned into spectacle, their private tragedy into national gossip. Yet without the press, the case may have faded quickly. Instead, it became immortalized, preserved not only in memory, but in print. The atmosphere of Iowa in 1912 was therefore one of contradiction. On the one hand, it was marked by the steady rhythms of farm and family life, by the trust in community and faith in God. On the other hand, it was increasingly vulnerable to the darker undercurrents of modernity, crime, sensationalism, and the unsettling awareness that the world was changing faster than anyone could control. The Villisca axe murders struck like lightning into this tension, exposing both the fragility of innocence and the hunger for explanation in a society unprepared to face such horror. This is why the murders were not just a crime, but a cultural event. They shook not only Villisca, but the entire Midwest, forcing communities everywhere to ask themselves unsettling questions. Could such violence happen here? Could the person you trust most be hiding unspeakable secrets? And what happens to the soul of a town when its most cherished values, family, faith, and trust, are shattered overnight? These are the questions that carried the Villisca murders beyond the borders of Iowa, transforming them into one of the most infamous and haunting mysteries in American history. Nightfall settled gently over Villisca on June 9, 1912. The summer air was still, the kind of calm that seemed ordinary to the townsfolk, who trusted that nothing beyond the hum of insects and the creak of farmhouse doors would disturb the darkness. That evening, the Moore household glowed faintly with lamplight as the family returned from the Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church. Josiah and Sarah Moore, their 4 children, and the 2 Stillinger girls, friends of the Moore children invited to spend the night, entered the quiet safety of the house on East 2nd Street, unaware of the fate that awaited them. Within the walls of that modest white home, laughter and prayers closed the day, and by 10 p.m., silence had overtaken the rooms. No one knew that in this silence, a shadow had already taken root. The first detail investigators would later note was how calculated the crime appeared. The murderer, whoever he was, had entered with deliberate calm, waiting until every last lamp was extinguished. The doors were locked not from outside but from within, sealing the family's fate. What followed was not the chaos of an opportunistic act, but the chilling discipline of someone who knew he would not be interrupted. In the master bedroom, Josiah and Sarah lay in their bed, unaware of the footsteps that crept closer. The blow that came to Josiah was swift, the flat of an axe striking with a force meant to disarm and destroy in silence. Again and again, the steel met flesh and bone until the man who had been a respected father and businessman was reduced to stillness. Sarah's turn came next, her final breaths extinguished in the same merciless fashion. But it did not stop there. Upstairs, the 4 more children slept in their beds. The killer's path carried him forward step by step into the innocence of youth. Each child was dispatched in the same way, the axe falling with dreadful precision. Their small bodies, curled in sleep, never had a chance to resist. Lena and Ina Stillinger, the guests in the home, were the last to die. Some accounts suggest Lena may have stirred, perhaps even fought briefly, but the result was no different. By the time the killer was finished, 8 lives had been extinguished, and the small home had become a slaughterhouse. What unsettled investigators most was not just the brutality, but the ritualistic elements. Each mirror in the house was covered, some with clothing, some with fabric, as though the murderer could not bear the reflection of his own face. Windows were draped with cloth, shielding the carnage from the outside world. The axe itself, once wielded with such force, was abandoned in the guest bedroom, its blade dark with blood. In the kitchen, a plate of food sat uneaten on the table, as though the killer had paused, perhaps even attempted to eat before leaving it behind. A bowl of bloody water suggested he had washed his hands before slipping back into the night. The timeline of events remains a point of speculation. No neighbors reported hearing screams. No dog barked. The house was sealed in such stillness that by morning, when the family failed to appear for daily chores and errands, only a gnawing unease began to stir in town. It was not until a neighbor entered and discovered the bodies that the nightmare of Villisca spilled into daylight. The sheer scale of violence, visited upon an entire family, was unlike anything the town, or indeed the country, had ever witnessed. The shock spread quickly. By the time authorities arrived, dozens of townsfolk had already crowded into the home, trampling through rooms, peering at the scene in horrified disbelief. The sanctity of the crime scene was destroyed within hours, fingerprints smudged, evidence lost forever. But in 1912, forensic science was crude, and the idea of preserving a scene was almost non-existent. Instead, the house became both spectacle and shrine, a place where neighbors whispered prayers while others gossiped about who could have done such a thing. Among the theories that emerged, each seemed more improbable than the last. Some believed it was the work of a traveling stranger, perhaps a deranged drifter who had slipped off the nearby train line. Others suspected someone from within Villisca itself, a neighbor, a rival, or even a friend. Suspicion fell on known figures and town business competitors, disgruntled parishioners, even ministers. The possibility that evil could live in plain sight, behind familiar faces, deepened the terror. The murders were no longer confined to a single house. They infected the entire community. Details of the violence spread through newspapers, which could not resist the macabre allure. Journalists described the wounds in gruesome detail, speculated on motives, and hinted at scandal. Readers across the country devoured the reports, and Villisca became a name synonymous with horror. For the residents, it was unbearable. Their town transformed into a stage for national fascination. They could not walk down the street without outsiders staring, pointing, or asking about the axe murders. For those closest to the victims, the horror lingered in quieter ways. Friends recalled the laughter of the Moore children, now silenced forever. Parishioners looked at the pew where Sarah had once sat. Every detail of ordinary life became tainted, reshaped by the knowledge that within the walls of a simple home, an unimaginable act had occurred. The sound of an axe striking wood, once common in rural life, became unbearable. The smallest creak of floorboards at night reminded families that safety could no longer be assumed. And yet, despite the attention, the investigation yielded nothing conclusive. Suspects came and went. One minister confessed, then recanted, his story shifting like smoke. Another man, tried twice for the crime, was ultimately acquitted. Each time hope for justice flickered, it was extinguished by lack of evidence, unreliable testimony, or the sheer impossibility of piecing together the crime from the chaos left behind. The killer remained a phantom, his identity hidden in the void left by the violence. This lack of resolution deepened the horror. A crime without an answer lingers differently in the mind. It does not close, does not settle. Instead, it festers, weaving itself into folklore, superstition, and whispered tales. Parents warned children to lock their doors, though many admitted they never truly believed a locked door could stop such evil. Pastors preached about sin and redemption, though some quietly admitted that even faith felt fragile after Villisca. The house itself became a wound in the town's landscape, its walls holding not just memory but accusation. And as the years passed, the sense of violation never fully healed. To this day, what happened in that house remains one of the most confounding mysteries in American crime history. But on that night in 1912, for the people who lived it, it was not a mystery at all. It was the sound of footsteps on a wooden floor, the glint of moonlight on an axe, the silence that followed each fall of the blade. It was the knowledge that in a place as ordinary and safe as Villisca, the unimaginable had not only arrived, it had stayed. The morning of June 10, 1912, left Villisca forever altered. When word spread of the massacre, it moved faster than the ringing of church bells, faster than the trains that passed through town. In a matter of hours, the streets swelled with residents, their faces pale with disbelief. Some wept openly, others muttered prayers under their breath, while many stood silent, unable to process the enormity of what had happened. in a town where everyone was someone's neighbor. The slaughter of the Moore family and the Stillinger girls was not just a crime, it was a collective wound. The Moore relatives were among the first to confront the horror. Sarah Moore's mother reportedly fainted upon hearing the news, collapsing into the arms of neighbors. Friends who had seen the family at church the previous evening struggled to reconcile the memory of cheerful hymns with the grim reality behind the locked doors of the Moore house. The Stillinger family, too, were devastated beyond words. Sending their daughters for a simple overnight stay had turned into an irretrievable loss. Mothers across Villisca clutched their children tighter that day, haunted by the possibility that the same fate could strike them without warning. Doctors who examined the scene were shaken in ways that transcended professional detachment. Physicians of the early 20th century were accustomed to illness, to injury, even to violent accidents on farms or railroads. But this was different. This was not nature's cruelty or mechanical failure. It was human intent, deliberate and merciless. They noted the methodical nature of the killings, the covering of mirrors, the extinguishing of lamps, the sheer brutality inflicted even after death. Some whispered about psychosis, others about ritual. Yet psychology was still a young science, and the language to describe such a crime was inadequate. Words like deranged or lunatic floated through conversations, but they did little to explain the unimaginable. Religious leaders stepped forward to provide comfort, though their sermons carried an undertone of unease. Ministers filled their pulpits with warnings about sin, temptation, and the fragility of life. Congregations were told that evil had entered their midst and that vigilance, spiritual and moral, was the only defense. For some, this message brought solace, reinforcing faith as a shield against the darkness. For others, it deepened the sense of dread, suggesting that no amount of prayer could have spared the Moors. The church, once a sanctuary of certainty, now had to wrestle with questions it could not fully answer. Neighbors responded with a mix of grief and suspicion. In the days that followed, friendly waves across fences grew rare. People avoided eye contact, whispering about who might have been capable of such savagery. Rumors spread like wildfire. A drifter seen near the train depot, a rival businessman with a grudge, a minister with strange habits. Each new theory cast fresh shadows, dividing the community. Doors that had once remained unlocked at night were bolted shut. Lamps burned longer into the evening. In a town where trust had been the cornerstone of daily life, fear hollowed out the bonds between neighbors. The newspapers amplified the tension. Local papers, unaccustomed to sensational crime, stumbled between factual reporting and lurid detail. National papers seized upon the story, branding it as the axe murders of Villisca. Headlines screamed of blood-curdling mysteries and ritual slaughter, ensuring that the small town's tragedy was consumed by a fascinated and horrified public. Reporters descended upon Villisca, their notebooks filled with rumor and speculation, often blurring the line between truth and spectacle. Residents who had never sought fame now found themselves photographed, interviewed, and scrutinized by strangers eager to profit from their grief. Psychologically, the effect on Villisca was profound. Families described sleepless nights, the faintest sound stirring terror. Children wet their beds, plagued by nightmares of shadowy figures and creaking floorboards. Adults confessed to hearing phantom footsteps or glimpses of movement in darkened rooms. What today we might label as trauma or post-traumatic stress was then described simply as nervousness or hysteria. Yet the symptoms were real, leaving scars on the collective psyche of the town. The Moores' home, once a place of warmth, became a haunting presence. Some avoided passing it altogether, crossing the street rather than glance at its windows. Scientists and criminologists of the era tried to impose order on the chaos. Early forensic experts examined blood patterns, the condition of the weapon, and the sequence of attacks. Their methods were primitive by today's standards, but they sought to frame the violence within rational boundaries. Some suggested the killer was left-handed, others that he was right-handed. Theories abounded about whether the murderer had acted out of passion, revenge, or sheer madness. Yet every conclusion met with contradiction, and the uncertainty only heightened the terror. If science could not solve it, and faith could not shield against it, then what hope remained? The longer the case dragged on, the more it fractured the social fabric of Villisca. Families avoided hosting visitors. Children were warned against playing after dark. Businesses suffered as outsiders began to view the town with suspicion, as though it had been cursed. For years, Villisca bore a stigma, its name a shorthand for dread. It was not just the murders that haunted the people, but the absence of resolution. An unanswered question becomes a ghost in itself, lingering at the edges of daily life, refusing to fade. In time, the reactions of that summer crystallized into a shared mythology. For some, the murders were a moral parable, proof that evil lurked even in the most ordinary places. For others, they became a puzzle to be solved, with endless speculation keeping the mystery alive across generations. But for those who lived through it, the reactions were simpler and more painful. It was the silence at breakfast tables where laughter had once rung. It was the locked doors and shuttered windows. It was the realization that the world was not as safe, not as predictable, as they had always believed. The town of Villisca never truly recovered. Its people endured, rebuilt, and carried on as small communities do. But beneath the surface, the horror lingered, reshaping their sense of security, their trust in one another, and their place in the wider world. The reaction of society to the Villisca axe murders was not a single cry of grief, but a prolonged echo that reverberated through decades. A reminder that once violence enters the heart of a community, its shadow is never entirely banished. It was in the suffocating silence of the Moore home that the climax of Villisca's tragedy took shape. By the time lawmen and doctors stepped across the threshold, the once ordinary dwelling had already drawn a crowd of neighbors, each desperate to know the truth but unprepared for what awaited inside. The heat of the June morning pressed against the windows, but the air inside the house felt heavy, stagnant, as though death itself had taken residence and refused to leave. Sheriff officers pushed their way through, their boots creaking against wooden floorboards, the sound unnaturally loud in the hush. The house smelled of iron, sweat, and something sour that no one could quite place. A lamp sat extinguished in the hallway, and beside it lay the first sign of intrusion. The axe itself, abandoned yet commanding, its surface slick with darkened blood. Men who had held axes 1,000 times before to chop wood or clear brush suddenly found themselves unable to look at it without shuddering. In their hands it was a tool of life, of survival. Here it had become something else entirely, a weapon of unimaginable cruelty. The procession began with the bedroom of Josiah and Sarah Moore. The sight was unbearable, even to seasoned men accustomed to accident and hardship. Josiah's body bore the brunt of the attack, his head battered with such force that the ceiling above showed marks where the axe had swung too high. Sarah lay beside him, her face unrecognizable, her body partially shielded by bedding hastily drawn in a final, futile gesture of defense. The men in the room stood frozen, their breaths shallow. One muttered a prayer under his breath. Another turned away, swallowing hard, unable to remain. The sheriff, pale and unsteady, whispered that this was only the beginning. They ascended the narrow staircase next. Each step groaned beneath their weight, echoing in the silence like a drumbeat of dread. At the top, the children's rooms awaited. The discovery there was worse than any had imagined. Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, 4 young lives extinguished in their sleep. Their small bodies were positioned as though frozen mid-dream, blankets tangled, limbs relaxed, faces serene in contrast to the brutality visited upon them. The axe had spared no mercy. Hardened men found their eyes stinging, their hands trembling as they tried to reconcile the innocence of the children with the violence before them. The air grew heavier still, as though grief itself had settled like dust across every surface. But it was the Stillinger girls, Ina and Lena, who left investigators with the deepest unease. Found in the guest bedroom, they bore not only the marks of the weapon but signs of possible struggle. Lena, in particular, appeared to have shifted in her final moments, perhaps awakened by the sound of the killer's approach. Her position suggested a fight, however brief, as though she had sensed the horror in the room and tried desperately to resist it. That fragment of resistance, the flicker of awareness in the darkness, made the crime even more chilling. It revealed the killer was not only methodical but merciless, unshaken even when confronted by a child's desperate attempt to survive. Details accumulated like shadows. Every mirror in the house had been covered, draped in fabric or clothing, as though the murderer sought to erase reflection itself. Windows had been shrouded to block the dawn from revealing the carnage. A plate of food left untouched suggested an appetite that had died mid-act. A bowl of bloodied water indicated a ritual cleansing before departure. These details were not the random traces of chaos, they were deliberate, almost ceremonial, pointing toward a mind both twisted and composed. It was this balance, this mixture of savagery and control, that horrified the townspeople most. Outside, the crowd swelled. Whispers rippled through the throng as each new revelation filtered out. Mothers pulled children closer, shielding them from the descriptions, while men clenched fists and muttered vows of vengeance. Some swore it must have been an outsider, a drifter passing through on the railway, for surely no neighbor could be capable of such barbarity. Others, more quietly, wondered if evil might indeed live among them, hidden behind the familiar smile of a shopkeeper, a preacher, or a friend. Suspicion began to spread like a sickness, poisoning the trust that had once bound the town together. The climax of the horror was not a single moment, but a series of realizations, each one darker than the last. First came the knowledge that an entire family had been slaughtered in their own home. Then came the recognition that no one had heard it happen, that the killer had moved silently through their town, unchecked. Finally came the most chilling realization of all, that the murderer had vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but questions and fear. A crime of such magnitude should have pointed clearly to its author, but instead it dissolved into uncertainty, as though the killer had melted into the very air of Villisca. When night fell again, less than 24 hours after the discovery, the town sat in paralyzing dread. Lamps glowed in every window. Doors were barred, rifles loaded, yet no one slept. In every creak of timber, every rustle of wind, they heard echoes of footsteps. Parents lay awake, listening to the steady breathing of their children, wondering if it might be interrupted as suddenly as the more children's had been. The killer had proven that locks were meaningless, that safety was an illusion. The terror was not just of what had happened, but of what might happen again. For the investigators, too, the climax was suffocating. They had no clear suspect, no confession, no solid trail to follow. Each theory collapsed under scrutiny, each clue dissolved into contradiction. The axe itself, the most damning piece of evidence, told them nothing of its wielder beyond the brutality of his hand. The silence of the house mocked them, as though daring them to extract truth from shadows. They left that night shaken, their resolve weakened by the enormity of the crime. Villisca had become not only a crime scene, but a riddle, and the killer had written his question in blood. And so the climax of the Villisca axe murders is not a neat revelation or a tidy confession. It is the moment when a community and a nation realized that some horrors defy explanation. It is the point where shock hardened into fear, and fear calcified into legend. The Moore home was no longer simply a residence, it was a tomb, a symbol, and a question mark carved into history. What happened there in June of 1912 remains frozen in time, a climax without resolution, where the only certainty is the weight of silence, and the memory of 8 lives extinguished beneath the swing of an axe. In the years that followed the murders, Villisca became a town suspended between memory and mystery. The Moore house stood quietly on East 2nd Street, its white siding weathering under the seasons, yet its presence was anything but ordinary. Children dared each other to run up to the porch and touch the door. Adults passed by with lowered eyes, quickening their steps as though afraid the shadows might reach out. For those who lived in Villisca, the tragedy was never in the past, it lingered, persistent, like a wound that refused to heal. Families of the victims carried grief in ways words could not capture. The Stillinger family mourned their daughters every time they walked past the Moore home, haunted by the decision to let them spend the night. The surviving relatives of Josiah and Sarah Moore lived with a sorrow complicated by the absence of justice. They could not direct their anger at a name or a face, only at an emptiness where an answer should have been. Grief without resolution becomes something different. It becomes a cycle, a quiet torment that repeats itself every time a door creaks in the night or a newspaper recalls the case. The community, too, remained fractured. Suspicion never entirely vanished. Long after the funerals, townsfolk continued to whisper theories, pointing fingers at neighbors, preachers, and strangers alike. Some swore they saw the killer's shadow in passing figures along the railway. Others believed he had vanished into the wilderness, or that he lived among them still, hiding in plain sight. Each theory was as impossible to prove as it was to dismiss. The mystery fed itself, ensuring that the fear never fully ebbed. Over the decades, the case was revisited again and again by investigators, journalists, and amateur sleuths. Each time, new suspects emerged only to collapse under scrutiny. One minister confessed and retracted, leaving behind a trail of doubt. A state senator was accused, tried, and acquitted, his reputation forever stained by association. None of these answers satisfied the deeper question. Who could move with such quiet purpose through a family's home, extinguish 8 lives, and then simply disappear? The failure to answer left the crime larger than any single suspect. It became not just a murder, but a myth. The house itself absorbed this myth, its walls steeped in memory. Visitors described a palpable heaviness, a sense that the room still carried the echoes of that night. Some swore they felt cold drafts where none should be, or heard faint footsteps across the floorboards. Whether these were products of imagination or something else, they added to the legend. The Moore House became a relic of fear, preserved not only in its structure but in the cultural memory of Villisca and beyond. Culturally, the murders marked a turning point in how Americans thought about crime. The idea that safety could be shattered so completely in a small, close-knit town struck at the heart of national identity. If Villisca could fall to such horror, then nowhere was safe. Newspapers across the country reported the story with a fascination that bordered on obsession, and the case was seared into public consciousness. The Villisca axe murders became shorthand for the unknown, a grim reminder that evil did not always wear a recognizable face. Psychologists in later years revisited the case as an early example of mass trauma. They noted the ripple effects: insomnia, fear of strangers, communal suspicion, even the reshaping of daily habits. What had once been a town of open doors became a town of locks and bolts. The sound of an axe against wood, once part of rural life, became unbearable for many. It was as though the crime had rewritten the collective nervous system of the community. Even decades later, older residents described unease when recalling that summer, their voices lowering as though the killer might still be listening. And then there is the most haunting question of all: why? Without motive, the crime resists explanation. Was it personal revenge? Random madness? Ritual? The covered mirrors, the drawn curtains, the uneaten meal, each clue gestures toward meaning but offers none. The absence of motive is perhaps the cruelest part of the story. Without a reason, the crime cannot be understood. Without understanding, it cannot be contained. It spills out endlessly, from one generation to the next, demanding answers that will never come. Today, more than a century later, the Villisca axe murders remain unsolved. The Moore House still stands, restored and preserved, its walls holding silence heavier than words. Tourists visit, drawn by curiosity, by fear, by the human need to confront the unknown. They walk through the rooms, imagining the night of June 1912, listening for echoes. Some leave convinced they felt something, an unseen presence, a trace of memory. Others leave with only the chill of history, the knowledge that what happened there cannot be undone. The epilogue of Villisca is not a conclusion. It is an open door, one that leads into the unsettling truth about human history, that some mysteries remain unsolved, some questions remain unanswered. The killer of the Moore family and the Stillinger girls left behind no confession, no certainty, only silence. And in that silence lies the power of the story, for it reminds us that horror does not always end with explanation. Sometimes it lingers, unresolved, becoming part of the fabric of a place, a community, a nation. When you think of Villisca now, you do not simply think of a town in Iowa. You think of shadows moving quietly through wooden halls. You think of footsteps unheard, of a locked door that failed to protect, of an axe lifted in the dark. You think of questions whispered across generations, questions that will never find an answer. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of the Villisca axe murders. Not the act itself, but the silence that followed it, a silence that still echoes, reminding us that history is not only written by what we know, but also by what we cannot explain.